Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Usomi webinar series. I'm Gennaro Danna from Legnano near Milan. I'm a neuroradiologist, and I'm so happy to be here today to moderate this webinar. With me, over the speaker, we have today Pnar Yilmaz, who is part of Usomi webinar committee. Thank you for our sponsor, Bracco, for supporting us in this initiative. I give the microphone to my co-moderator to say welcome to the speaker.
Thank you, Gennaro, for this kind introduction. Today we have Amy Kotsenas. She's an associate professor of radiology and neuroradiologist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And she's also board certified in clinical informatics and chairs the Mayo Clinic Clinical Digital Imaging Committee and leads the team that oversees enterprise imaging and Mayo Clinic's digital imaging archive. Her team successfully executed and completed a major transition from 5 separate radiology information systems and 9 separate picture archiving and communication systems, also known as RIS and PACS in the radiology community, to a single converged RIS PACS platform across the Mayo Clinic radiology enterprise. This is the largest ITM implementation in Mayo Clinic's history. Dr. Kotsenas is also a council vice speaker and member of the board of cancer at the American College of Radiology and serves on the board of the ACR Data Science Institute. So in this era of big data and AI, medical data, including images, are being created and shared on a large scale. This technology and the ability to widely share data are evolving faster than legal and ethical frameworks. During this lecture, we will discuss more about this new world to ensure medical data is used in ways that respect patient autonomy and that serves patients' best interests in a fair and nice manner. So we are very happy that Dr. Kotsenas will share her experience on ethical consideration within AI today. The floor is yours. Sorry, I have to mention one thing. If you have any questions, please share them in the Q&A box and we will discuss these at the end of the lecture. Dr. Kotsenas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Yilmaz, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Gennaro for the kind invitation to speak with you today. It's my honor to speak with you this evening and to talk about ethical considerations in AI. I have no disclosures potentially relevant to this presentation. When we think of AI, we think of it as blue skies ahead. It has game-changing promise to do things like improve our efficiency, to bring down the costs of healthcare, to accelerate research and development, and to improve healthcare outcomes. But there are signs of stormy skies ahead. While AI holds a lot of promise for healthcare, lately there have been many worries that these complex and opaque systems could potentially do more societal harm than economic good. There's very little government oversight at this point in time, and private companies are using AI software to make determinations about numerous things like employment, creditworthiness, even criminal justice. And we're starting to see these decisions being made in healthcare as well. AI is moving rapidly, and unfortunately, the legal and ethical framework is lagging behind. Intelligence without ethics is no intelligence at all. And I'm here to say that ethics in AI is not a PR or marketing issue. It's not something that's nice to add on if you have the budget or the time. It's really central to the safe and effective use of AI in healthcare. And ultimately, ethical implementation of AI is going to be critical to the health of our patients. So throughout this talk, I'll be discussing both ethical principles and legal ones. So we'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two. And I'll start by saying that I'm not a bioethicist or a legal expert, but I'm going to share a brief summary of some of the differences between these two, as well as some work that has already been done in ethics that may be applicable to AI, and specifically to AI as applied to radiology. For starters, what is the difference between ethics and the law? Ethics is basically guidelines and principles about how to behave, either as individuals or as organizations. They're a set of individual or professional norms. They're not normally formally codified. And if you breach these principles, there's no formal penalties. On the other hand, the law is a set of formal rules and regulations. It's created by government and it's codified and written down. If you break the rules or regulations, breach will result in penalties that can range from things like fines to things like being put in jail. Frequently, legal principles will lag behind ethical principles, with the ethical principles being established first. And in rare and unfortunate cases, the law may actually codify behavior that's considered unethical. As in the case with most disruptive technologies, assessment of and consensus on the possible ethical and legal pitfalls of AI technology are lagging far behind the technological development. I'll talk a little bit about some ethical principles that we can use to apply to our approach to AI in medicine. And I'll go all the way back to the Hippocratic Oath, which all of us are familiar with. Hippocrates, among other things in the Hippocratic Oath, said that anything that we see or hear in connection with our professional practice and relation to patients should be considered private. So many millennia before the US HIPAA rules and GDPR were even imagined, Hippocrates considered privacy to be something key to ethical medical practice. More recently, many people will follow the ethical principles outlined in the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was commissioned by the US Congress following the notorious Tuskegee syphilis study. The Belmont Report was published in 1976 and laid out core principles of autonomy, meaning respect for persons and patients, beneficence, meaning doing things in the best interest of patients, justice, that care would be distributed in a fair manner, and then afterwards, a fourth principle, non-maleficence, or the duty to do no harm, was added. When the Belmont Report was commissioned and published in 1976, secondary use of data acquired for clinical purposes wasn't covered. This really provided to patients that were participating in research trials. And certainly at the time of the Belmont Report, AI and many of the secondary uses of patient clinical data today were not envisioned. More recently, in 2013, the Hastings Center started to publish some work in this area. They talk about what's called a learning healthcare system. And essentially, they have said that what in the past, and certainly in the 1970s and 80s, was considered a sharp separation between research and clinical activities, that more recently, the lines between what we consider clinical and research are more blurred. And in fact, not only are they blurred, but integration of these two activities is essential if we're going to provide the needed changes to our healthcare systems necessary to improve care. And they proposed this essentially circle of feedback where we can interpret data, assess the feedback, and then change clinical practice and continually improve our clinical practice in this learning healthcare environment. In the report that they published in 2013, an ethics framework for this new learning healthcare system, they outlined 7 obligations. The first 4, to respect the rights and dignity of patients, to respect the clinical judgment of clinicians, to provide optimal care to each patient, and to avoid imposing non-clinical risks and burdens on patients, sound very familiar. They really reiterate principles from the Hippocratic Oath and principles from the Belmont Report. And there are things that we've all internalized in our practice today. The last three, items 5 through 6, however, are new and are specific to the learning healthcare system context that they described. Item number 5, to reduce health inequalities among populations, they consider both a moral and ethical imperative. They also consider it an obligation to conduct responsible activities that foster learning from clinical care and from clinical information. So not only do they say that we can use clinical data to learn, but that we must. It's one of our obligations. Lastly, in item number 7, they put forth a proposal that we're all obligated to contribute to the common purpose of improving the quality and value of clinical care and healthcare systems. And with this last obligation, they specifically brought patients into the conversation, saying that patients have a responsibility to allow their data to be used to improve the quality of healthcare and the value of our health systems. Beginning in 2019, we started to see radiology organizations weigh in on the issues of ethics related to artificial intelligence. The Canadian Association of Radiologists was among the first. They published their report in May of 2019. And their white paper basically provides a framework for study of the legal and ethical issues related to AI and medical imaging. Note that they did not provide solutions for all of these things, but more of a framework of the things that we need to be attentive to. Later in that same year, in 2019, the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Radiologists published their report on ethical principles for AI in medicine, and they put forth 8 ethical principles: avoidance of bias, transparency and explainability, privacy and protection of data, decision-making on diagnosis and treatment, liability for decisions made, application of human values, and governance. And we'll talk about many of these as we go through the rest of the talk. In November of 2019, a joint statement was released under the ACR leadership of Dr. Raim Geis. He convened a joint effort with members from all of the organizations you see here, including your organization, to explore topics of ethics of AI and radiology. And one of the key things that came out of that group was the sense, and I've heard Dr. Geis say this many times, is that AI and machine learning are a team sport. And by that, he means that it's imperative that clinical experts and developers work together so that we can safely develop AI tools. But the ethics paper that was published in 2019 says that that's not sufficient. We really must include patients and other stakeholders in this dialogue as we develop ethical principles. So I will spend the rest of the time in this talk talking about some of these ethical principles. Again, we don't have all of the answers yet, but these are the key items around which ethical principles are currently in development. We'll talk about who owns the data, privacy, de-identification, and anonymization, the fallacy of patient consent, bias and generalizability in AI, managing conflicts of interest, and what happens when AI makes a mistake. We'll start off with who owns the data. And before we can answer the question of who owns the data, I think we need to talk about what exactly is ownership of data. Essentially, it's possession of and responsibility for information. Ownership confers rights to control access, but it also confers the responsibility to control access and maintain privacy. It confers a right to a share of any profit generated if we consider patient data a commodity. And ultimately, it gives the owner power and control. Whoever owns the code and the data is going to own the power when we're talking about AI. In the US, the concept of ownership of patient data varies from state to state. In most states, those shown here in gray, there are no laws identified that confer specific ownership or property rights to elements of the medical record. In a single US state, New Hampshire, the patient owns information in the medical record. And then in the rest of the states, those shown in purple, the hospital and/or physician are considered to own the medical record. And it's important to point out that if a physician is employed by a larger group or employed by a hospital, the ownership right of the medical record does not confer to that individual physician, but to the higher body. So to the group with which they're employed or the hospital with which they're employed. And that means that physicians can't take the data with them if they move from one institution to another. The GDPR confers many rights with respect to data. They include the right to be informed, the right of access, the right to rectification or to correct any errors in the data, the right to restrict processing, which may have implications for de-identification and anonymization, the right to data portability, the right to object, and rights about automated decision-making and profiling. While the GDPR says that natural persons should have control of their own personal data, one thing that the GDPR fails to specifically regulate, and the only thing that can guarantee data protection and privacy in the first place, is the right of ownership or the right of property. Now, while laws vary from country to country and state to state, patients have a significant stake in this game, and there are many patient advocacy organizations that are now starting to form that are advocating for patient ownership of their data. They posit that when you own your own data, you can choose who has access to it, and you can choose what is done with it, how it is used. So it's likely that we will see continued evolution of the legal framework around ownership of patient data. When we think about patient data, the primary purpose is really for providing clinical care, for making a diagnosis, and for determining an appropriate treatment. Once that clinical care has been provided, what is the purpose of the data? Well, there are many possible secondary uses of the data. They include things like billing and payment, quality and safety programs, in some cases, provider or facility accreditation. These data obviously can be used for research. In some cases, they may be used for marketing, or they may be used for other purposes, which would include strictly commercial activities. And I think where you fall on the, what should this data be used for, particularly with respect to AI, may fall down to whether you think of AI as improving quality and safety, or whether you think of AI as being a strictly commercial activity. One group that has weighed in with strong opinions on the secondary use of patient data is Dr. David Larson and his colleagues at Stanford University. They posit that after the clinical data are acquired for the primary purpose of diagnosing and treating the patient, any further secondary use of the data should be regarded as a form of public good. They say that this data should be made freely and publicly available, and that any profiting from the data would be considered unethical. And I think we should stop for a moment and talk about the difference between data and knowledge. So data is things like the images or observations related to the images, things like measurements, whereas knowledge is really synthesizing the data. It's analyzing the data and coming up with unique insights. Knowledge would also be the intellectual property that comes after using the data to develop an AI model or algorithm, for example. So Dr. Larson and his colleagues would say that selling the data itself as a commodity would be unethical. Whereas if you develop knowledge related to the data, such as an AI algorithm, then you should have the right to profit from that. They also made comments on data hoarding in the paper that they published in late 2020. They said that for organizations to hoard or keep data private is considered antithetical to the general norms of science and emphasis of the principle of openness with respect to science. They also, in their paper, reiterated the principles and obligations laid out by the Hastings report in the Learning Healthcare System Ethics Framework. And specifically, they reiterate the obligation of patients to contribute to the common purpose of improving the quality and value of clinical care within healthcare systems. And in referencing this specific obligation, they say that patients should not be asked to, nor be required to, consent to secondary use of their data, provided it's being used in a learning healthcare system framework. Now, you may agree or disagree with that particular ethical principle, but I think it's going to be really key to engage patients and the public in this particular conversation. As we've seen over the last year with the COVID pandemic, simply asking people to comply with principles that may be for the greater good is not sufficient. So I think we need to both educate and engage our patients as this conversation moves forward. The American Medical Informatics Association has also weighed in on secondary use of data with a white paper that they published way back in 2007. They were a little bit more forward thinking. And they advocate for transparent policies and practices for the secondary use of health data, a focus on data control rather than the concept of data ownership per se, a consensus around privacy policy and security, increased public awareness, as we've just talked about. They think that any policies developed should be comprehensive in scope, and they advocated for national leadership on this front. And I would say that national leadership is not sufficient. It really should be international leadership. Ultimately, it's really critical that data access and control policies are clearly established between academic institutions and researcher AI developer staff. Institutions may claim ownership of the data, and they may say that you're not able to take it with you. It's important that policies are established to encourage collaboration between research colleagues, between academic institutions and industry, between authors and journals, and I think also between clinicians and patients. And these policies ideally should be developed before we even begin to collect data for the purpose of AI. We'll turn now to the topics of privacy, de-identification, and anonymization. And here there is also a legal framework that provides some guidance. In the US, HIPAA mandates that certain safeguards are put in place for protecting specifically health data with a focus on patients. In the EU, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, governs data access with a focus on EU citizens and not specifically on patients. There are also many hospitals and medical centers that may have their own rules regarding what data may be kept on premise, what is and what is not allowed to be shared with external parties, and with what types of external parties the data can be shared. Some of the concepts in the GDPR that apply to healthcare data are specifically the data concerning health and biometric data, including things like facial images. The GDPR requires both notice and consent, notice of how AI is used to make clinical decisions, and explicit consent for collection and use of sensitive personal data, including medical data. Unlike HIPAA in the United States, the GDPR provides that data may be anonymized or pseudonymized, but it doesn't give specific guidance or outline specific methods to de-identify the data. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, HIPAA, is the major US law that regulates collection and use of protected health information. HIPAA was enacted more than 2 decades ago, long before AI was envisioned. And HIPAA states that When data are de-identified according to specifically defined criteria that we'll talk about in a minute, further consent is not required for secondary use of those data. It's a provision known as the safe harbor provision. And it permits organizations that comply with de-identification by these HIPAA mandated safe harbor identifiers are able to use the data. They may be able to share the data if they're in compliance with de-identification, and they may even be able to sell PHI for secondary purposes. So HIPAA outlines 18 safe harbor identifiers. All of these identifiers must be removed from PHI by law before they can be shared outside of the institution or used for secondary purposes. They include obvious identifiers like name and address, but they also include, medical record and health plan numbers, things like license plate numbers or vehicle identifiers, driver's license numbers, etc. They also include things like finger and voice prints, photographic images, not limited to the face, and any other characteristic that could identify the individual, which is somewhat ambiguous and has implications for imaging because imaging is quite unique. Imaging shares many attributes with structured text-based data, which is more easily de-identifiable, and per the HIPAA regulations does not require secondary consent to reuse. But it also has some attributes similar to biologic tissue specimens and genomic data, which require by HIPAA regulations explicit consent from the patient. I think it's also important to understand that most researchers believe that complete anonymization of imaging data is not possible. And by anonymization, we mean de-identification without the possibility of re-identification. There are too many pieces of information that when combined can lead to re-identification of the patient. Some of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about de-identifying imaging data are things like the metadata that are included with imaging. For example, patient health, protected health information may be burned directly into the images, into the image pixels themselves. We see this sometimes with ultrasound where patient name, medical record number, accession number, information like that may be burned into the images themselves. Radiology imaging also contains metadata in the DICOM header. And the DICOM standard defines hundreds of tags. Some of these are public tags, and some of these are private proprietary tags established by the manufacturers of our imaging acquisition devices. And both the public and the private tags may contain PHI. So all of that information has to be scrubbed before the data can be used in a de-identified fashion. And it's important to remember that if you scrub the pixel data, most of the tools that are available may scrub all of the text data that's burned into the pixels. So you may be removing numerical values or measurements that were burned into the pixel data as well. And some of both the public and proprietary tags, if they're removed, may render the imaging data unusable for purposes of AI. Imaging also contains many quasi-identifiers. And what do we mean by that? Information that may not uniquely identify a patient, but when combined with other data fragments can accurately re-identify the patient. For example, radiographs may contain images of unique jewelry or other unique objects that the patient is wearing on their body at the time of imaging. Patients may also have medical devices that we take images of that may contain things like serial numbers that can be reused, used to re-identify them. And lastly, even the patient organs or anatomy may be unique enough that they can be re-identified. I think we've probably all had the experience of looking at a set of images and saying, I know that patient because we've seen those images before, and we can recall the story that goes with that patient. Additionally, there are concerns with facial recognition and imaging data. There are concerns that imaging of the head and neck can be reconstructed and combined with facial recognition software to re-identify the patient. This is work that was done by some of my colleagues at Mayo Clinic. This is the group that works on the Mayo Clinic study of aging and does studies related to Alzheimer's disease. They did a study with their patients in their Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. These are patients that get 3D MRI of the head to be able to study Alzheimer's disease. They reconstructed those images and used publicly available facial recognition software and were able to match 83% of the 3D images with patient photographs. As with pixel data, methods to obfuscate the 3D imaging, such as defacing and skull stripping, may remove enough of the data that it renders the data unusable for AI purposes. So de-identification best practices, unfortunately, there's no comprehensive commercial solution that can automatically de-identify data to meet requirements such as HIPAA. It remains largely a manual process, although there are some tools that can help to facilitate that. As I mentioned, the tools themselves may remove some of the critical pieces of data that are needed to conduct AI model development or algorithm development. And so it really requires a manual an auditing process, one, to make sure that you've removed all of the PHI, and two, to make sure that you haven't removed so much data that it's no longer usable for your purposes. And I've included a reference to a study and radiographics that talks about this in a little bit more detail. I'd like to move on to the fallacy of consent. Certainly in the US, the current state is that a general consent and authorization for medical treatment, we require a patient to sign that at the beginning of any appointment before they have any treatment. These are generally paper forms or available electronically in the patient portal prior to the visit and look very much like what is shown on the right-hand side of the screen. There is a lot of legal jargon, and they may state that data obtained during the patient's visit may be used not just for treatment, but for medical, scientific, or educational purposes, provided the patient's data remain private and the patient's identity is not revealed. When these forms are presented to patients and they're asked to sign them, there's generally no one available to explain these forms. They're not focused on imaging. No potential risks of secondary use are disclosed. And it's likely that many patients don't understand when they sign these forms that they've given passive consent for secondary use of their imaging. And I think even in cases where patients do understand that they're giving this consent, they may have serious concerns about how the information is used, who's going to have access to it, and if assurances of anonymity can be trusted. And there isn't anyone available for them to ask questions about or to give them confidence that their information will be used in a safe manner. So I published a paper earlier this year with colleagues from across the US with a focus on really empowering patients in the consent process. Empowering patients is a key principle of what we at the American College of Radiology call our Imaging 3.0 initiative. We proposed in this paper that any consent form should be easy to understand. It shouldn't contain a lot of legal jargon. And we proposed a tiered approach to opt in and out of sharing. You could opt in out of sharing certain types of data or portions of the health record, different types of non-clinical use, and different types of data use partners. Importantly, we included as one of our co-authors a patient representative, Mr. David Andrews. And I think one of the key principles coming out of our paper is that it's critically important to include patients in these conversations. So we proposed basically a very simple form that would ask patients whether or not we could use their images in the future, how we could use those images in the future, or to specify if they did not want any secondary use of their images to occur. Now, there are some potential pitfalls with this approach. Patients may opt out of giving consent to use their data. That could lead to gaps in the data. It could lead to bias in the data. And so we did not intend with this paper to say that this is the final solution. We really intended with this paper to begin a conversation about what are important elements of consent and how critical it is to include the patient voice in the conversation as we develop the ethical principles around consent. I'll turn next to bias and generalizability of AI. And I think there are many instances from outside of healthcare that are very instructional. Many of you may be familiar with Tay. Tay was a Twitter account that Microsoft released on March 23rd, 2016. Tay stands for Thinking About You, and Tay was intended to have conversations with people on Twitter. Microsoft enabled Tay to essentially mimic the tweets that it encountered when it was online. So the more tweets that Tay encountered, the more Tay was supposed to learn from the tweets. Unfortunately, what happened is, as often happens on social media, is that people started tweeting things that were deliberately offensive. There were things that were racially offensive, that were misogynistic, and Tay learned from all of these and quickly began tweeting offensive content itself. Microsoft ended up taking Tay offline less than 16 hours after it launched. You can see it had tweeted 96,000 times, and the majority of those tweets ended up being offensive tweets. Microsoft looked at ways to improve Tay and actually put it online a couple times in the days following the initial launch, but because they had designed it specifically to mimic behavior, they did not anticipate that Twitter users would deliberately behave in an offensive way. Something that they probably should have thought of before they put Tay out there, and certainly something that developers should be thinking about going forward. I also had the opportunity earlier this year to see the movie Coded Bias. In this movie, director Shalini Kantaya follows MIT Media Lab researcher Dr. Joy Buolamwini. And Dr. Buolamwini was interested in doing research related to facial recognition. So she had a facial recognition application, and when she opened it up on her computer, she found that it did not recognize her face. But she also had a mask on her desk that she had from a party that she had recently attended. And the mask that she had on her desk happened to be a white mask. And when she put that white mask on, she found that the facial recognition software on her computer recognized her face. So this represents a form of intersectional bias. She went on to study several applications that do facial recognition from some well-known software companies. She did this research in collaboration with Dr. Timnit Gebru, who was recently part of the ethics section at Google until she was dismissed from that job in January. And in their research, looking at these 3 different facial recognition algorithms, they found that when presented with lighter male faces, the software was able to recognize the faces nearly 100% of the time. When they looked at lighter female faces or darker male faces, recognition started to go down, and in some cases considerably. And then when they looked at darker female faces, they found that recognition went down even further. And I think it's important to understand that these algorithms, like this facial recognition one, are often most effective for men and white people. And that's because they're designed by mostly men and mostly white people. Only about 14% of AI researchers and developers are women, and a much smaller percent are women of color. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that biases end up being embedded into the algorithms that are developed. And this can have very real world consequences. It can have consequences for employment, creditworthiness, law enforcement, and the criminal justice system, even health and medicine. This was a study that was done a couple of years ago. The researchers reviewed 50,000 records from a large academic hospital in the United States. They did not disclose which hospital it was. And they looked at conditions like renal disease and diabetes. And they found that white patients were given higher risk scores based on having higher healthcare expenditures. And so they were therefore more likely to be selected for extra care, like more nursing or dedicated appointments with specialists. When in fact, Black patients were equally sick. They just had lower healthcare expenditures, in many cases because they had lower access to healthcare. And this bias from this algorithm cut the proportion of Black patients who got extra help by more than half. In an application a little bit closer to radiology, risk models can be used to do many things like designing trials, determining eligibility for trials. With individual patients, they can also be used to implement prevention strategies in women at high risk or allocate scarce resources such as screening access to MRI. A study done by Dr. Constance Lehman, who is a breast imager at MGH, and Professor Regina Barzilay at the MIT CSAIL lab, developed a deep learning model. It was a hybrid model that used both full field mammograms in addition to traditional risk factor information, taking into account to assess breast cancer risk. And if you look at the data, some of the traditional models, like the Tyler-Cuzick model, they have a very differential performance. And particularly when we look at performance in patients that are white versus patients that are African American. The Tyler-Cuzick model, when used to evaluate white patients, has an AUC of 0.62, whereas when it's used to evaluate African-American patients, the AUC is less than 0.5. It's worse than chance. Dr. Lehman and Professor Barzilay, in developing their model, wanted to ensure that there was no bias. And when they implemented their model and looked at the difference between African-American patients in green and white patients in purple, they found that the AUC was identical. So I think it's important to remember that data is our destiny, but it really reflects our history. AI replicates our world as it was and as it is today with the same biases and disparities. And as we saw with Tay, it can actually amplify those biases and disparities. So it's important as we develop algorithms to ask, for whom could this system or algorithm fail, and make sure we build into our development process steps to mitigate bias in AI. So processing the data to address biases before we use it to train algorithms. Embedding techniques to ensure fairness into the model development process. After the model has been developed, assessing the algorithm's outputs for any bias and making sure that it's fair, and then monitoring algorithms after deployment. I'll talk a little bit about managing conflicts of interest. This has been a hot topic in medicine over the last few years. JAMA actually did a special issue in May 2017 related to conflict of interest. They describe conflict of interest as existing Whenever professional judgment concerning the interest of the patient's welfare or validity of research is influenced by a secondary interest, such as secondary gain. And they also pointed out that perceptions of conflict of interest are just as important as actual conflicts of interest themselves. There's been a lot of investigation of this in the US with ProPublica publishing in 2014 that companies allocated $4.8 billion in gifts and payments to over 800,000 physicians and medical researchers. This led to the development of a website by which you can search any physician, hospital, or company by name and see what payments were made. There are a couple of different types of conflict of interest: individual or personal, or institutional. Individual or personal when the conflict exists at the individual employee level. Institutional when the institution or organization itself, or if officials in leadership or supervisory positions have conflicts. And this latter really becomes important as institutions or organizations enter into collaborative or co-development agreements with industry. Implicit in managing conflicts of interest is the sustained existence of human decision-making and providing care. And I mentioned that JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, devoted an entire issue to conflict of interest in May 2017. 23 new perspectives were offered, but none were related to AI and medical decision-making. AI is complex. There are numerous potential pitfalls and the potential to bias, as we've discussed. So it's important that radiologists and developers understand AI to provide the most benefit to patients. AI can serve roles in diagnosis, decision-making, individualized medicine, and medical education, but it also has the potential to threaten patient preference, patient safety, patient privacy, and the physician's role in patient care. We can find COIs with physicians who may be involved in AI startups, when they may have invested interest in outcomes of the algorithm, or if they're involved in its design. Examples of COI can be actual payments or in-kind payments for services to a company, an equity interest, a management position, or intellectual property rights. I think we talked a little bit about examples. But I want to talk about one unique threat. And I think we've all seen statements like this: the ultimate threat to radiology is machine learning. Zeke Emanuel, who now has a position in the Biden administration, says it could end radiology as a thriving specialty in 5 to 10 years. Jeffrey Hinton, known as one of the fathers of machine learning, says, as a radiologist, you're like Wile E. Coyote in the cartoon. You're over the edge of the cliff, but you haven't looked down. And Vinod Khosla said any radiologist who plans to practice in 10 years will be killing patients every day. Just this week, I saw this headline that an investor-owned radiology company foresees a future where AI potentially reads all mammograms. As physicians, we have a duty to provide care in the best interest of patient. And so conflict of interest may be anything that runs counter to that. With this, I'd like to introduce the concept of sabotage. It's possible that a conflicted physician could compromise data integrity because they're afraid AI could take away their job. They could promote or insert bias into the data, resulting in safety or health risks to patients. And the appearance of that conflict will lead to a loss of patient trust, which is really foundational in our ability to care for patients. Patients or others may ask about conflicts directly. So I think it's important that we have best practices for managing COIs. We can do this through a culture of transparency. At my organization, Mayo Clinic, the first item on our meeting agendas is disclosing any conflicts of interest. We allow conflicted individuals to participate in discussions, but they must be recused from decision making. You can also make public disclosure, divestment, or implement institutional or organizational oversight. When it is the institution itself that may have the conflict of interest, the first three still apply. And you may also establish an independent oversight board to remove the perception of conflict. I'll wrap up by talking about what if AI makes a mistake. I think this is a really critical area of opportunity for bioethics, regulation of software as a medical device. I think oversight for algorithms is going to be critical for patient safety, but it needs to be a fair process. We need to ensure that AI works for patients and for our society, and we need to do that before we put algorithms out there into the real world. The American College of Radiology has set forth some principles, and they're setting a pretty high bar. The ACR posits that algorithms should be useful, safe, and effective. They must be clinically validated before they're put into practice. There should be transparency in algorithm output. They should be continuously monitored in practice, free of unintended bias, and also working on reimbursement issues. There are many differences in approval of medical AI between the US and Europe. In the US, we have a more formal process with the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, but in both regions, work is being done to formalize approval of medical AI. With the FDA, we have seen within the last several months some conflicting information. The outgoing Health and Human Secretary from the Trump administration released new guidance on January 15th that eliminated a lot of the review for the 510K clearance that these devices had been undergoing in the US, primarily as a cost-saving measure. And all of the major US radiology organizations came out in opposition to this. Interestingly, the same week, the FDA itself made a conflicting announcement, basically supporting the development of machine learning best practices, fostering a patient-centered approach, including device transparency, and then advancing real-world performance monitoring pilots. So in the US, as physicians, we're all required to undergo continuous maintenance of our radiology board certification. I think we can imagine that something like this will be put in place for AI algorithms as well. And all of this is going to be done so that we can continue to maintain our trust in the AI algorithms, so that we as physicians and healthcare providers have that trust in the applications we're putting into practice, and so that our patients have trust in us that we're providing optimal care for them. I'll wrap it up with just a few take-home points. The first, now is really the time to act, to establish ethical guidelines for AI before these applications proliferate any further. We really need to have a sound and clear policies for data use and for implementation of these algorithms. Data is destiny. We won't make progress unless we proactively recognize and address the biases in the data before we create AI. And we should always ask ourselves, for whom could this algorithm fail? And fix that issue before we put it out into practice. And then lastly, I'll leave you with the words of my friend, Dr. Raim Geis. AI and machine learning are a team sport. It's imperative that clinical experts and developers work together in developing AI, but it is not sufficient. We must include patients and other stakeholders in this dialogue as we go forward. And then I'll leave you with the words of one of my organization's founders, Dr. William J. Mayo. He publicly articulated the guiding principle of our practice, the needs of the patient come first, in 1910. I think this guiding principle will serve us all well as we venture forth into the new world of AI. I thank you for your time, and I think we'll have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Ami, for your wonderful lecture. Very, very effective. Pinar, would you like to start with some questions?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for this extensive and very clear presentation. We have a question from Daniel Pinto dos Santos. To what extent does data need to be anonymized in the learning healthcare environment? If data is made public, it could be possible to trace back to a specific patient.
I think that is a great, I think that's a great question. I don't think it's clear yet to what extent data must be anonymized. And as I said, it's not clear if data is truly anonymizable. You know, if you look at some of the big tech companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, for example, they have so much data on us that it's impossible that even small snippets of data related to a patient could be combined with information that they already have about us to re-identify them. So I think that is one of the potential pitfalls of the learning healthcare environment is, you know, it really relies on faith in everyone being a good actor and that there would be no bad actors. So I think that there's still a lot of discussion to be had about whether this is the best way forward or not.
Yes, thank you. In the same line, I have a question myself. For example, there are a lot of challenges going on. What are your thoughts on that? Because there's also, I think, regulations in that per hospital, of course, that data has to be anonymized, but it's also out there.
Yeah, so you know, I think some of these things vary from institution to institution and what they permit. I think many are starting to use a federated approach where organizations will keep their data on site and the algorithm will move from institution to institution. So with challenges, perhaps you bring the algorithm or the challenge to the data versus bringing the data to the algorithm.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Also, a comment by me. I really appreciated the part of the lecture about the need to educate and engage the patients, especially in this moment, and it's really an important advice for all of us. I really appreciated this that part. Also, I noted some questions by our past president Eric Ranchert. Eric, if you would you like to? The microphone is yours. To give the question to Ami Kotsenas.
Hi, I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, great. I have a lot of questions, but I won't ask them all. But you know, one of the main questions that's triggering me is the availability of AI tools. You know, so that's also an ethical question, and I couldn't find it in your presentation, unfortunately. But you know, how will these tools be made available? Who will have access to these tools? And you know, patients not having access to tools might cause a discrimination as well, or might cause a schism in society. So what are your thoughts about that? How should that be organized?
So I think that's a great point, and apologies for the oversight in my presentation. I had a limited time and didn't get to everything, but I think that is a very important consideration, and I think it's also one of the great concerns when you talk about ethics related to AI, is that this will actually widen many of the healthcare disparities that we see, with, you know, a greater number of, you know, haves, a smaller number of haves versus a greater number of have-nots that don't have access to those tools. So I would say that I agree completely that these tools need to be made widely available, so that we don't have an extension of healthcare disparities.
In the last journal of the Dutch Radiological Society, the president of the society wrote that maybe we should go to a centralized way of making these tools available.
I think that's a very interesting approach. I'm not sure what some of the developers of these tools would think. And, I think that's where we start to get into some of the things that make ethics very interesting, but also make it very challenging.
Okay, I noted many questions from the audience, but we are almost we have almost finished the time. Just a quick, if you can, a quick answer from this quick question from Emanuele Neri, Pisa, Italy. How should the patient be effectively involved in providing guidelines on ethics of AI?
Well, I think that there are several ways that we can engage patients. Certainly, when we're talking about some of the large radiology organizations, I talked about the collaborative effort between the North American and European societies. I think at that level, we can engage patients, we can engage patient advocacy groups and patient advocates as we're creating guidelines within our organizations and for our members. I think within our home institutions, we can do the same with patients and patient advocates. I think ultimately we are going to have to do some education of the patient community at large, much as we've done with other aspects of radiologic care, helping patients to feel safe about contrast administration, that radiation from CT scans is not going to cause cancer. We've done education in those regards, and I think we're going to have to do some similar things with respect to with AI, with use of data, etc.
Okay, thank you, Amy. I think we could go to the conclusion. Maybe Pinar, would you like to conclude with some final thought?
Yes, thank you very much. I think I really like the aspect of putting the patient central. That was also one of the slogans of the Erasmus Medical Center. So I think it's very important to raise that awareness of this new era of artificial intelligence implementing in our practice, and to make that aware for the patients, because for us it's also a black box, but for them it's even more a black space. I really want to thank you a lot for this great presentation and for your time to give this lecture, and for everyone asking these interesting questions and listening to our lecture, and also Bracco for sponsoring this lecture. So thank you everyone, and have a great evening, afternoon, depending on where you are.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.